Hello and welcome to another episode in our Conversations with Sound Artists series. This is a co-production of the Dolby Institute and the Soundworks Collection. My name is Glenn Kaiser. I'm the director of the Dolby Institute, and in this particular series of conversations, we're focusing on kind of the long-term collaboration between directors and their sound artists. So I'm thrilled to be here in Culver City on the lot at Sony Pictures today, talking with Edgar Wright and Julian Slater about their work together. Gentlemen, hello and welcome to the show.
Thanks for having us.
Hello.
Edgar Wright, obviously one of the most interesting, I think, directors working today, has been working with Julian on the sound for his films, starting with Shaun of the Dead in 2004, and they've worked together basically straight through Hot Fuzz, Scott Pilgrim vs. the World, The World's End, and then obviously this last summer with Baby Driver. So I guess my first question is to both of you, like, what's the secret of this happy marriage? Like, what attracted you to each other in the first place, and how did this relationship get going?
I think, probably based on my first experience doing Shaun of the Dead with Julian, having done sort of TV before that, and even done one very no-budget film, like sort of 9 years before Shaun of the Dead, I think, and this isn't the case with all the sound people I work with, but definitely with a couple of them where you felt like you were getting the bare minimum. And I remembered with Shaun, the greatest thing about it was that, like, Julian, I think, like, matched my sort of creative ambitions. It's like, it was a great experience because it felt like, how can we push this further? What else can we do? To sort of elevate what we already have, which was something that was good. But, especially with a lower budget film like Shaun of the Dead, like sort of like a huge amount of your production value is what you hear. People don't really think about that so much, and a lot of lower budget films are sort of ruined by their sound. So here was a good example of a movie, especially in the genre it was in, where we could just take it a lot further than the money that we had,
Right, and especially like looking at Shaun of the Dead again, I didn't really realize that most of the third act is really in the pub, in the Winchester pub, but the sound of the zombies outside is kind of this constant presence, and I think the sound design in that sense really, as you're saying, broadened it out and made it much bigger because it gave a sense of the world that was happening outside of this very contained kind of set piece. So for you, what were some of the challenges for Shaun of the Dead? Obviously budget.
It's not so much challenge. It's more like the kind of creative playground that you get to inhabit. I think the thing with all of Edgar's movies is, there's never just a talky scene. Even if it's like the scenes in the pub when at the beginning of the movie when they're talking, there's stuff always happening that's either playing off what the main characters are saying at any one time, or even eye looks, or it's never a question of. I always think with Edgar, with the soundtracks, they're kind of three-dimensional. They're never just a first-time listen. There's always things that Edgar keeps, wanting to put in the backgrounds that are reflecting what's going on with the main characters. It's never a question of just putting in a pub atmosphere and letting it go. It's what can be done to add to this specific scene. And that's the same with all of Edgar's movies. He's one of these directors who just thinks about sound. Obviously, with Baby Driver, but with all of his movies, it's in the script. He's one of these directors who knows the importance of what sound can bring, and he not only embraces it, but he pushes that on and through the whole process, all the way through to the final mix. It's a never-ending kind of evolving soundscape where Edgar just kind of keeps pushing and pushing and pushing, and I'm thankful for that.
Yeah. So Julian just said that this is part of the script, that this is baked into sound references. So I'm kind of curious for you, Edgar. Where did that? I find that a lot of, especially writer directors, don't necessarily have a really great understanding of how to use sound as a storytelling tool. So where did that come from? Is that something that you learned, in film school, or did it kind of come out of your early experience, or was it just always something that you sort of understood innately?
Well, as a film school reject, I got to say it was not from film school. I don't know. That's a very good question, actually. I think it's probably just through the appreciation of movies themselves. You know, I think sort of like I had I think also it's through like understanding sort of like sound in movies, but also just through working. Like sort of, I remember like I'd done this. Like I said, I did this. I used to make amateur films, and I used to edit them myself. And then I made a really like no budget film when I was 20 years old, which was like the first thing that I did. And in all of those cases, the sound was really limiting to it. When I used to edit like films myself, I used to steal like gunshots off other movies. So part of the way that you learn is by cannibalizing other things. Is that I think if you sort of like making a movie is like, oh, if you like this toy car, you've got to kind of take the toy car apart and figure out how it works. So I think through that, having done low budget stuff where I didn't really have the money or the tools to do like a decent mix, when you actually sort of start working in an environment where you have those opportunities and you can start building in ideas. And it was a TV show that I did called Spaced, where we played a lot, which had some of the same editing team that went on to do Shaun and Hot Fuzz and Baby Driver et al. And on those, you sort of like kept building up the sort of sound, like in the kind of the edit. So you'd sort of go into the mix with like this wall of sound of all these little details. And then I think that was a sort of, for me, was an interesting lesson. I sort of had all the ideas and I put them all in at an editing stage. But then it's in the mixes, you know, then finessing that. I think then by the time we did Shaun and I started working with Julian for the first time, there were just lots of ideas to do with the very theme of the movie where you could express it in sound. And in a lot of cases, it was the idea of like what you would hear or not hear in the middle of a zombie apocalypse. And some of it is like you said, like Julian said, it's like the inspiration for the story. I always used to find it kind of like living in London. I used to find it kind of disconcerting in a big city like that when a city becomes that huge, like police sirens blaring past or alarms going off, or even somebody screaming in the distance, nobody necessarily does anything about it.
They don't react to it. Yeah.
You don't react to it. It's just like sort of, this is like sort of the sound of a big city. So the idea of like this being a sort of a growing sense of unease during like a sort of a zombie epidemic was really interesting. And just the ideas of like car alarms going off and nobody has switched them off, or like burger alarms going off, like sounds of smashing glass in the distance, sounds of helicopters going above, you know. So we built up a lot of these soundscapes, not just and to sort of like hear the things that you couldn't necessarily afford to show them, but also the characters themselves couldn't see them. Sometimes when you're cocooned in like the pub or they're just in their flat, you know, you get the sense that there's some military presence or something going on, but you can't see it, you can only hear it. And, you know, even things like in Shaun of the Dead, there were some great things that we did where we recorded a lot of wild tracks of the zombies on the day, but we kept bolstering this. We had this idea, and we made a little chorus, I remember, which I think involved members of Coldplay. Is that right?
That's right, yeah.
I think so. Chris Martin was
He did,
there,
yeah.
and
Because
Johnny
Chris
Buckman.
Martin has a little cameo in the...
As himself.
Yeah.
He is not, as IMDb states, a zombie. Let's just clear that up on the record once and for all. Chris Martin is not a zombie. He appears as himself. But one day, I think Hackenbackers,
That's
right?
right, yeah.
Or where we mixed the first movie, we gathered together a little mob, including me and Simon and some other people, and we basically did like a sort of a zombie Gregorian choir where we would play the scenes, most of the sort of last kind of third in the Winchester, and do like a long zombie track where... And I would be conducting it.
Of the moans and all that sort
yeah,
of
but
thing.
it also, as the scenes became more dramatic, as people started shouting, the moans would get higher. So it was
higher
like...
in pitch. Like
No, it was more like getting like sort of just... So I remember like I remember us all standing around a mic, like going... And you were almost like conducting like a zombie theremin. It was amazing because I remember standing there like, being like an orchestra conductor conducting these moans. But that's something that like by the end of that you've got like a 20-minute track, and that's something that then you can double track it, or like we would play around with that on top of what we already had. But it was just to give this like, you know, sort of other dimension to it. you know. So I think that's the thing, and that's sort of where we started working, and why Julian's done everything else. Is like, I think for a movie of that scope and budget, it was like an extraordinarily like well realized soundtrack.
Right. Yeah.
You know.
Yeah.
And in fact, the way Edgar works, his Avid tracks are really, really intricate with regards to the sound and the sound design. Edgar's not one of these directors who kind of just concentrates on the picture and then hands it over to me. Or you're constantly cutting with this. I mean, the way you work with Paul is you cut a scene for picture and then you go through and you start putting sounds in, right? I mean, it's a constant thing. The two things work hand in hand.
Yeah, and I think that comes from when I used to do TV stuff. Like there was some, especially on this show Spaced, like the show just wouldn't work without the sound on it. So it wasn't like I would never hand a rough cut into the network with no music, no sound.
Because they would have no idea what they were looking at.
It'd just be like dead air. It just didn't work without it.
Well, that kind of segued into the end of the question I wanted to ask you, which is, now that you guys have done 5 movies together, sort of how do you work together? Like, do you show him the script before you go shoot? I mean, at what point do you get involved in the film? You know, how much time does Edgar spend on the mixing stage? You know, I'm curious about how the sausage gets made in this.
I guess as the projects have moved on, I get more and more involved earlier, right, Edgar? I mean, Edgar, we had breakfast around the corner from his house a few years ago when he told me about Baby Driver and, you know, when it was going to happen, and we start talking ideas at that point, and then the most recent 2 films, I think it is, I've got involved and actually come on board very early into the director's cut. I think on Baby, I was there on week 4 of the director's cut.
Oh, wow, okay.
We never have a spotting. I don't think we've ever had a spotting session.
Is that
like
true?
Even on Shaun of the Dead, where we sit through the whole movie and you say, here I want this, there I want that. I don't think we've ever done that. It's not that kind of...
No, I don't think so. Not so formally. I think it's like he said, it's like a lot of the ideas are there, and it's about like, you know, I think also it's like always becomes about doing more prep. For instance, in this one, even when we were doing this location scouts, I sort of asked the sound recordist if she would record wild tracks whilst we were doing the tech scout.
Really?
Yeah, because I wanted there to be what I wanted to do is I wanted to sort of see if there were sounds that were like sort of you know, indigenous, is that the right word? Like sort of occurring in those locations that we might be able to use. And then it does end up informing it. It's like, you know, like in Baby Driver, like the first location that we were shooting in downtown Atlanta, it had this tram that went by, and you don't really see the tram that much, but you hear it.
Hear it on the
and
logos.
It's just like you hear it, like it literally comes up on the studio logos. And then also like in Atlanta, like it's a major train hub. So there's trains all the time. And then actually when you're doing location scouts, usually like if you hear a train, it's like, oh dear, we're in trouble, you know. But in this case, it was actually like, you know, we could use these. This is a good sort of punctuation throughout the movie. So throughout that movie, you can keep in the place of like rolling thunder, you can hear kind of distant trains.
The trains, right.
And like
right.
sometimes, you know, in a sort of like in a tense kind of scene, you like hear a mournful in the distance. So I actually, and in that case of getting the wild tracks together, it was also this thing of, in this particular one, there was an element of the dog wagging the tail a little bit, because we heard, and this is something I could share with Julian very early on, in order to sort of sell it to the studio or whoever was going to finance it, one of the things that I did was that I had not only had all the songs worked out for Baby Driver, in some cases it made these sound effects mixes.
Really?
With this London DJ who's actually worked in a sort of unofficial capacity on some of the movies, or even just on the extras on the DVDs. But in this case, I sort of needed a bit of help. So I got this guy, his name's Mark Nicholson, Ozzy Misu is his DJ name. And we built up these like Baby Driver mixes, so that when people listened to it, they could get their head around the idea. And he probably only did it with like 8 of the songs, but it gave you the idea of like what the film was going to be.
And is that because in Baby Driver, like I'm thinking about the tequila,
yeah,
is that because there's such a tight integration of the action to the music and I can hear the the shooting and the bullet hits in time with it. So that's all kind of stuff that you kind of almost not pre-vis, but you pre-audioized.
So
right?
both. I mean, because you have to. It isn't so. The editing in the movie is like a masterclass. However, it always slightly annoys me when people, like fans or reviewers, saying, "Oh, it's amazing how the gunfight is edited to the music." It's like, no, it's actually the other way around. It's like we shot the scene to the sound, and we choreographed it to the sound. So we'd already designed those sections, and then obviously the thing that's great later, once you've got that, and it's like the Tequila one is a great example because it's building up to this gunfight, but it isn't like we shot hours and hours of action footage. We shot specifically for those beats, and we even like edited an animatic to the music track that we'd done, so that we knew like
you knew exactly what you
this
needed.
guy is doing these 3 shots, then Jamie as Bats is doing these 2 shots, then it goes back to these guys doing these 2 shots, then it goes. So you actually, if you look on the Blu-ray, actually has the animatics, and they're like stunningly close to the finished film. Then obviously the next phase of it, like that's kind of like the temp, but then the next phase of it is actually to sort of like create that same effect. And then Julian's kind of like challenge is to sort of like maintain the sort of the fun of the idea, but still sort of make it more grounded in terms of it being the right guns, and then also playing with it in terms of like the balance and I mean, you can explain a bit more about even just the kind of changing the pitches of the guns themselves.
Yeah. So I guess throughout the movie, it's full of many things that are obviously syncopated to the music, and it's a Edgar hands over this kind of amazing template that then I and my crew take from him, and then try and kind of do a mushroom cloud of try and explode it outwards, so that it's not just the stuff you see on the screen, but stuff you hear off screen and in the surround. So for the Tequila, for example, we go through and we try various different gunshots and see, and they're obviously in time with the drums, but more often than not, you put something in, it doesn't work tonally, so you take it out and you try a different gun, and then you start to play with the ricochets that happen in the surrounds that happen at the same time, and you're just building up layers and layers and layers. And the trick with it was to make it work both cinematically and musically, and quite often the two things don't work. The sirens, for example, in all the car chases, the sirens, whether they're the two tones or the bleep bleeps, they're always syncopated to the music. And take the bell bottoms, the first car chase sequence
from the very first bank robbery and the first big car chase.
And this was a huge learning curve for me, because I work in a world of sound effects and sound design, not necessarily the music. The composer takes care of the music, and I take care of the sound effects and the sound design. But on this time, we had to kind of, each piece of music was tempo mapped, which didn't know what that was, and had to learn how to do it and how to work with it.
So for our audience who may not know, what is a tempo map?
A tempo map is literally building a click track that goes with the
beat of the
the
music.
beat of the music. And something like the John Spencer piece, the bell bottoms, it's not just a 1 2 3 4 1 2 3 4. It changes throughout the whole piece of music, because it's musicians playing live and feeling it as they're doing it. So we tempo map, say, the sirens to the beat. But if you do that, then the siren itself, rather than just going woo 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 woo, it goes woo 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 woo. It changes, and it sounds ridiculous. So we have to figure out a way to introduce the siren when it sounds cool and sounds believable as a piece of audio for the movie, but also works in rhythm to that moment in time to the music. And then as soon as it doesn't, we then take it out of the mix, bury it, reset it, and then feed it back into the mix. So it's like a 3D kind of jigsaw puzzle, where you're figuring out what bits work where, and so it sounds homogeneous, doesn't distract. It sounds great as a piece of cinema for see what you listen to, but it also works musically with a piece of music.
So what I'm hearing is that the mix for Baby Driver, which just to the casual listener feels like it just fell into place and it's all really elegant and works really nicely together, was an enormous amount of work to make all those pieces.
Yeah, and it's a constant self reflection and checking with that mix to make sure that I don't want to speak for Edgar, but I personally never wanted it to sound like it was in your face 100% of the time, so that after 20 minutes of it, the audience were getting, oh look, it's syncopated to the music,
Sure.
and it starts to wear. So it's this thing of on a scale of 1 to 10, sometimes you may play it 10 in the mix, sometimes you may play it 2, and first time listen, second time listen, you may not even pick up on it. But it's to make it a natural thing and not make it kind of. I remember a quote from George Lucas when he was, on Star Wars. Just because it's a really cool scene and it's got great visual effects, you don't want to play it all the time. It's a question of the audience discovering certain things within the mix.
Yeah, it's about sort of modulating the balance between the music and the sound effects throughout. Like you said, like Ginny just said, is like you don't want people to you also don't want people to get the measure of it. One of the nice things about the movie is that the sound is playing in different ways. The songs are all diegetic. So there's no song in the movie apart from the final end credit song, which is like playing a score. Everything else is playing either in his ears,
Right.
on a record player,
radio,
like on a radio,
yeah.
like sort of. But most of them are in his ears. So in those cases, you're sort of creating this feeling where you are inside his head, and thus. A good example is like the scene where Dave Brubeck is playing and Ansel Elgort's listening to that with his earbuds in and not listening to Kevin Spacey. So that's like a classic example where you're constantly switching the sort of subjective angle on it. Now it's like we're listening to what he is and we cannot hear Kevin Spacey talking.
Right.
And then that has a payoff with the fact that he can lip read. So that was the great thing, is that sort of like, I think Julian's right. If we had done the entire film like the bell-bottom sequence at the start, it would become wearing.
Sure.
But it keeps sort of modulating throughout. And then, the other key thing to me was that I wanted to do a sound, like a movie with a soundtrack where you weren't just fading down the music. Most movies, they play like a great intro, and then as soon as the lyrics come in, fade in, and then somebody starts saying some exposition about...
And somebody starts talking.
Yes, exactly, about the next plot point.
Yeah.
About the MacGuffin that they need to steal.
Well, I'm curious to kind of go a little bit further on this theme that you're talking about music versus sound effects, or not necessarily versus music and sound effects, because, you said that typically you're kind of working in your sound effects world, but with Baby Driver, obviously, the music was, it was a huge thematic element from the very beginning. But I'm kind of curious for you, in all of your movies, like as a director, you have these two really powerful sound tools in your arsenal. You've got sound design, you've got music. How do you decide what's going to go where, and what tool are you going to use? What are you going to favor in any particular scene or moment?
Well, I think the thing is, and this is sort of like... especially in the last 3 movies, this has been something that I've like sort of kept like working on, because I like the idea. Hot Fuzz was a little different, because even though I had songs in it, it was like mostly like a score film, and lots of sound work in that. Starting with Scott Pilgrim Through the World's End and culminating in Baby Driver, it was this idea of like, how can these things all work together? So I think the key is actually there are several parts in The World's End and Baby Driver where there is a song playing and there is score playing and there are sound effects at the same time.
A song and score and sound effects at the same time.
Yeah, and the thing with that is that that's something that can only exist in the movie, because you can't necessarily put it on the soundtrack album like that. But we've been really lucky in that another collaborator of ours who we've now worked with several times is Steve Price, who was the Oscar-winning composer of Gravity. But as we know him, the music editor on Scott Pilgrim vs. the World. But I mean, that's actually when we first worked together. He was also the arranger on that score as well with Nigel Godrich. And then actually, I had worked with him even before that. When I was first thinking about Baby Driver 10 years ago, I needed a music editor to help me break down the songs that I wanted to use. So maybe about 10 of the songs in Baby Driver I knew 10 years ago which ones they
Really?
were going to be.
Wow.
And I asked a music supervisor, hey, do you know a good music editor who could help me break down these songs? And he said, oh yeah, you should meet Steve Price. So we met for coffee in London. He helped me out. And then he came on to work on Scott Pilgrim, and he worked on The World's End. And then by this time, he's now like a big-time composer. And so I called him and I said, do you still want to... I mean, there's not... How much minutage of score is there in Baby Driver?
I think there's
half an hour?
I think more. I think there's like 40 minutes in total, 45.
There's 40 minutes of score on Baby.
think so.
That's really surprising to me
Well,
because I just
this
think
is-
of the songs.
Well, this is the thing that I think is very sort of clever about it. And if you listen to it again, is... And also, by the way, I broached it with Steve. I said, do you want to be involved? Because I know it's not like doing a full score. And he goes, absolutely. He really wanted to do it. And the good thing with him is that, and this has been the case on all the things I work with, is that he does score that is like sympathetic to the songs. So if you watch the film again, when score does come in, you'll notice that it like, you know, a song might end in a key and then his score picks that up. Oh, and then it like sort of, and his score finishes and goes into the next intro. So he's actually sort of like bridging these gaps and actually making these beautiful music transitions, which just sort of, I always wanted the film to feel like you were watching a musical in the sense of that every scene has a different song. And even in the few scenes where there is no music, there's sort of something rhythmic in the sound effects. It might be the train, it might be an air conditioner, it might be something where there's some kind of like sense of like a pulse in the background. But a really good example is like Steve's work, which Julian could break it down, is like, and also the combination of song, score, and sound effects is like the opening 30 seconds of the movie, because you can explain how that works.
Yeah, so we start off on the Sony logo, which we pitch to work to turn into tinnitus, which then Steve picks up. It goes ting, and goes a long reverb into a single held note or tone. Steve then picks up in the same. So I send Steve my idea of the pitch correction of the Sony logo. He takes it. He works his music either around it, or he'll change the pitch of that and then send me his score back for that moment. I put that into my Pro Tools. Then I think what comes out of that is like the tram bell that Edgar was talking about, that was recorded months and months before the shoot even, that's pitched to work with that tone. And then the brake squeak of the WRX comes out of that you pull up. And then Steve is also going through that at the same time, which is in the same key as the John Spencer Blues Explosion. So it's like an amalgam of all these different things, and it's what happens when there's true collaboration. Because I know Steve as Steve, the music editor. He's not obviously the music editor anymore, but
That's the relationship.
It's the relationship I have with him, and he's a true friend. So I can phone him up or go around his house to have Sunday lunch, which I would do. And we can talk about it, and there's no fear of upsetting him or suggesting something that I feel is going to, offend him, or he's just much more receptive than other people could be. And it's the same thing with Edgar. It's like, it's no coincidence that some of my best work is with Edgar, and it's because of the environment that he supplies. As Edgar works with his picture editors that he's worked with for many years, and his DOP and his cinematographer and me, and we all know each other, and we have a relationship where true collaboration. You're not afraid. I'm certainly not afraid to suggest something to Edgar where I'm worried he's going to say, "What the hell are you thinking? That's not going to work."
And we've all been on mixing stages where there's no communication between the sound team and the music team, and everybody shows up and they feel like they're each 100% responsible for the success of the film. And so then you just have this train wreck on the stage that you have to spend a lot of time kind of sorting through.
And that can only come pretty much from the top, from someone like Edgar, who how he feels about sound and sound design. Regardless of the fact that Edgar has written those words, I've worked with directors who have written the script, and pretty much all they really care about is the dialogue, which is totally fine and valid, totally fine and valid. But Edgar's a bit of an exception, certainly with regards to people I've experienced, where he's not only written the script, but he wants to embellish the script with the sound design and the mix. It's, the two things work in conjunction the whole time.
That was something I when I was doing TV stuff, I used to, I realized that with music publishing and licensing that like you could play two things at the same time and clear them separately, but create something completely new. So sometimes I would have like these kind of, like dance tracks that I was using in the show. And then I put a bit of library music that would go underneath, like an underscore that was leading into something else. And then, with the movies start doing that for real. Like in The World's End is a good example. There's a couple of times there where a song is playing, and then it's like a relay race. It's like Steve's cue is starting during the song and eventually like takes over. Mm-hmm. But it is in the sort of the same tempo. And then it's like something where like sometimes people listen to it saying, "Oh, where did you get that orchestral version of Silver Bullet?" It's like, it does not exist. It exists in the mix and nowhere else. And I think that's one of the things with Baby Driver is that you think sometimes when it's about, is there a way of releasing the movie mixes of the songs? And I said, that is the movie.
Right, that's the experience.
It's like, that is the experience. It's like, I don't think you want to isolate that, like actually sort of seeing these like there's other in the finale of Baby Driver with the Queen song, there's the song playing at full volume, like in and in different perspectives, but also there's parts of the score that are sort of like coming in and out of that sequence, and again like working with the music, and Steve is also great because he's like Gene said, he's a composer who doesn't have he doesn't have the ego that some other composers do, where some other composers would be like, this is my part, get rid of anything else. Steve's great in terms of that he is like working with what you've already done and like taking it to another place. And then there are moments where like his score fully flourishes, and then it's like, but even he is like sort of like, he is inspired sometimes by our sound design, that what we've done within the sequence will give him an idea of where to take it. So it is like a real collaboration in that sense.
There's like that scene with Doc when they return after Tequila, and they go back to the hideout, the bananas scene.
Yeah,
and where it's very subtle, but it's pretty much every sound effect that you see that is on screen, the dropping of the bags or the light switches, are interweaved with the score. We pick out the sounds, send them to Steve. Steve works them into the score. So the light switches, they go once and then 2, 3, 4, and then they move into the surrounds. And there's a repeat echo that just keeps going with with his score. And he then scores with it and in conjunction. And then he'll throw me the sounds back, and then I'll adjust them again to make them work even better. And it's like this constant to and fro between the two departments, for want of a better word.
Yeah, and it sort of creates something that sort of it's it's kind of a surreptitious feeling, because you're sort of not quite sure what you're listening to other than it's all working. That's a great example of that scene, because that was something that was inspired initially. It was two things. It was like I'd been listening to sort of like a lot of avant-garde artists who make music out of found sound, like Matt Moss. And some guy I found on the internet, I think his name's The Quiet American. I never figured out who he was or how to clear any of his stuff. But if you're watching this, you're an inspiration. But there was this thing, he'd done this song, it was just called 3 Trains. And it was basically like a lot of wild tracks mixed together to create like ambient music. Anyway, after I'd been to Atlanta and all you hear is trains the whole time, I was like, we should do a train, do something with this. I think we tempted with that other thing, but obviously it wasn't scored to it. But then Steve picked up the ball and ran with it. And then there were great things in that. The other one is great is when Kevin Spacey... So there's the train sound of like this kind of like sound of a train coming to sort of like as a sort of doomy sound. There's the light switch echoes and stuff that kind of keep going and then become like a tick-tock of the track. And there's another great one is when Kevin Spacey gets up out of his seat and the seat goes... And then it goes... and it keeps kind of echoing. So it's sort of... and then the general idea of that is that Baby is so anxious within the scene that he's becoming sort of hypersensitive to every sound around him.
Right.
On top of that, whenever there's a scene in the movie which doesn't have a song playing, you are aware of his tinnitus, or tinnitus as we say in the UK. Tinnitus. So that was another thing that we created through sound, and then also through his score, to make the viewer understand what it's like when music's not playing.
What it's like being in baby's head when,
Exactly.
when the
And
music's not there, right?
all of the scenes that don't have music playing have a sort of a sense of the tinnitus in sound or music. So that then when the next song kicks in and the tinnitus stops, you're like,
It becomes a relief when the music comes back
and then
in.
you understand why Baby does it.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up, because in watching the film again, I think, when you think back on Baby Driver, obviously big music sequences, big set pieces, lots of action going on. But I really enjoyed, going back and looking at it again, how much like really small, quiet, really interesting sound design you were able to kind of cut through. Mm-hmm. And I'm thinking specifically, you were talking about the tinnitus. There's that wonderful little moment when Baby and Deborah are at the fancy dinner together, and she kind of reaches out and they do, the on the wine glass that creates the tone, which is sort of the tinnitus. And it's this lovely little, sound design moment that, maybe has a musical tone to it too, but it really cuts through. And it's remarkable to me because, that's a sound design moment, but you didn't discover that in post-production. You had to think about that when you were writing. You had to shoot it that way. So you are always thinking about sound as you're going through the other parts of the process.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it is written into the script, and then some of it comes in the storyboards, and then some of it comes in choreography. Like when you're doing choreography for a scene like in the restaurant, it becomes pretty simple, but the first thing you do is like say to the production, and I say, can you get us the props so we can kind of have a little play around with this thing? And then ideas come out of that, and then sound ideas come out of that as well. I think with a lot of those kind of smaller moments, you're still working in that sense of outside of the big set pieces, the sense that, like sort of the thing in real life when the world syncs up with the music you're listening to. So you might be sitting in a traffic jam listening to music, and your windshield wipers are in time with the music, and you might notice these things, or a particular guitar solo starts and the sun comes out, and it's like, life is in time with my music. And the idea with Baby Driver is it's all like that.
Right.
There's not like a moment where that's not happening. So we're always trying to create things that were on beat, always looking for real sounds that actually happen, whether he's like flicking money or Kevin Spacey's counting money.
Sure.
Or even just I'm trying to think of some other good examples, but yeah, I think those things, you're always looking for those things where you can create an extra sort of motif that makes sense in the scene.
Yeah.
In the first scene with the bank heist is like the alarms
right
kind of kick in at the right point in the music, all of that kind of stuff.
And then I'd go for walks in London to try and get inspiration for other sounds to throw in.
Yeah.
So, for example, the Harlem Shuffle, when Baby's going to get the coffee, there's a whole load of things that are happening off
There's
screen.
a tremendous amount of sound design work that's filtered into
There's like
that,
a
later into
road
that
drill,
song.
a pneumatic
Right.
road
Yeah.
drill, someone drilling by the boarding, and that's me kind of just walking through London trying to think, okay, what other things could be thrown in there that we're not necessarily seeing visually, but we can hear off screen.
Yeah, we actually, with that sequence, that was one of the ones where we'd done this rough kind of sound effects mix. And in that case, all of the sound effects are just things ripped off the internet or whatever, but there was like chatter, so we'd put sort of people chatting in the street. And then I thought, that's kind of, so we could do a thing where, do this like Robert Altman-esque thing where you're walking through other people's conversations and you hear them. So then when we did the scene, the people in that sequence who do talk are like mic'd up for the entire shot. This is the coffee run sequence with Harlem Shuffle.
Which is like what, 3 minutes? It's a long
3-minute shot, yeah. So those people, everybody could hear the song. We were either playing it out loud or they were listening to it on earwigs. But some of those key people can hear the song. So when they talk, they are talking in rhythm with the song.
Yeah.
And they're just doing it the whole time. So by the end of that, you got a wild track that's 3 minutes long of like, how many people in that scene? Like 8?
Mm-hmm.
Like a bunch of them. And also, they're not in it the whole. So the street preacher that you can hear We recorded him for the whole thing.
Oh, that's interesting.
And so you can hear him like when he's not even in vision.
Sure.
And then you see him. And then he's still behind. And then there's like sort of like at the start of the shot, there's the guy outside the store saying like, "Where are you?"
Right.
Like, you know, and then at the end of it, he's berating that guy and says, "Be on time."
Yeah.
And he's doing that in time with the music. Also, you see like there's a trumpet player who at the start of the shot is walking along with his kind of suitcase. And then at the end of the shot, he's playing along with Harlem Shuffle. And he's in the back of the shot playing it live. But he's listening to Harlem Shuffle and recording it. So all of those separate things, all of those guys are mic'd up. And then I guess we did Wild Tracks with them as well. Mm-hmm. You know, so that we had like an entire like sort of slice of life of what you could hear on the street. I mean, exactly what Julian was saying. I would do that when I was writing. Is sometimes I would drive through LA, put my radio on the automatic scanner. I mean, not scanner. You know when it kind of just tunes through?
Sure, yeah.
It's trying to find something, and I just record that on my iPhone. Because then in sort of inspiration for the bit where Baby's trying to find the right song.
Right.
Is that the kind of thing that
he can't get away until he finds the right song.
Yeah, and also, you know, when you drive in LA, like you could be going for about 5 minutes before you find Led Zeppelin or something. You know, it's just like getting through the religious channel is like a slow bit of traditional Mexican music. It's like another slow like ballad. Oh, this is like a smooth song. Oh, great! Here comes Led Zeppelin. Let's just drive.
Yeah, right.
You know, like so. But I recorded those things, and it was also just interesting hearing like snippets of the news.
Yeah.
You know, we did a lot of stuff even after we'd finished filming. We wanted to build in lots of radio reports. You hear a lot of the radio, and so wrote all this B dialogue for like newscasters. But we just went back to like Atlanta stations, even though we were like mixing in London, and just approached a bunch of Atlanta DJs and said, "Can you read this?"
Because you needed authentic Atlanta voices, right?
Yeah, and also kind of all of those people
fun.
are like thrilled to be involved,
Sure.
and then and then when the movie's out, they're going, "Hey, if you listen closely, you can hear my voice in the Harlem Shuffle."
Hey,
scene."
that's good promotion.
So there's probably
too.
about 7 real Atlanta DJs talking in there, which is, and they will do it for nothing for like takes them 15 minutes, and it's kind of more authentic than a loop group, you know.
Of course,
and
of
fun.
course.
I feel like Dolby Atmos was invented for that Harlem Shuffle scene. Just the
How
whole
so?
thing. Well, like Edgar's saying, you've got things that are happening. It's all from, as Baby's walking along and the POV of him.
Sure.
And all these things that are happening that you don't necessarily see, but are happening off screen, of course, with the
Well,
what
and
we
you
have.
can get so specific in
Yeah.
placement, and stuff isn't
Yeah.
competing with each other up in the front channels.
Stuff that you can't obviously do with 6 speakers, but you can do with a whole array of speakers. And that was my first time, or both of our first times doing something in Dolby
Oh, is that
Atmos
true?
native.
Yeah.
Yeah, and what a great way to.
Well, you guys made great use of the format.
Thank you.
Absolutely. So Julie, I'm curious for you. I think one of the things that is kind of a hallmark of Edgar's kind of visual style as a storyteller is there tend to be, especially in some of the comedies, like a lot of sequences with shortcuts, interesting camera angles, kind of compression of narrative into very small chunks. But it also sort of that has a very specific kind of tone from the storyteller about like you're going to go on an interesting journey. The story is not going to be told in kind of the traditional way that you may be used to. So what is that? Obviously, that's a gift for you as a sound designer. But how does that influence what you're doing on the sound effects tracks?
Well, I think it's interesting to note that obviously as Edgar's directing style is changing. I mean, from Shaun of the Dead to Baby Driver, Shaun obviously had, and Hot Fuzz had lots of those smash cuts and those kind of things happening, and there's less so in Baby Driver. So, I'm keeping up with Edgar and how he's changing as a director and evolving my sound design tastes to follow what it is that Edgar's doing, picture wise, and what he's asking stroke demanding of me. So Edgar drives the truck and I jump in and follow on behind and try and hold on.
Julian's brought up an interesting kind of topic. How is your style changing as a director?
Well, I think in that particular case with those narrative shortcut things, in Shaun of the Dead, like you have all these. I thought it would be funny to like have these quite ominous, like action cuts that sort of seem like they would be, from like a Tony Scott movie or something, but they were for really mundane things. So in Shaun of the Dead, like all of the opening shots like that is like making tea, making toast, like brushing your teeth, but it's building up to finally like a gun loading montage in the finale. Hot Fuzz is sort of similar thing, but like a lot of the kind of the montages and that are detailing the boring part of the job, because the bit that you never see, the paperwork and just all the bureaucracy, and seeing that in these like sort of, like how would Michael Bay shoot a scene of people having to file out hours of paperwork? So that was sort of the joke with that. I guess the slight difference, and so I like that style, and it's also something where you kind of, I think as a director, you're letting the audience know that like sort of that like you said, you're being taken on a journey. It's like sort of like you're forcing them to pay attention to different things. So it's not just like, like a lot of contemporary comedies are sort of like barely directed. It's like they let the actors kind of like run it. And this is different. This is more stylized by design. Baby Driver, there's a few less of those, mainly because the song is kind of like guiding it to some extent. And I wanted almost like every scene in Baby Driver is a different song. So like sometimes it switches, but for the most part it's like a song per scene. And as such, like you're sort of led transitions wise by what the intro is or what that's doing. And because things are happening more in real time in Baby Driver, there's less time for those kind of compression of time transitions. There's a couple of them, but for the most part, it's sort of doing a different thing. So I think that's the thing, is that you also don't want the kind of the audience to be completely up to speed with what you're doing and start mixing it up or like sort of subverting things. So I guess that's it. I mean, in Baby Driver, like the action plays out longer in places because of the nature of what we're doing, and I think also it's like it's funny because I sort of become known for those quick cuts, but then in a lot of the movies there are some really long shots as well.
Of course, yeah.
But right back to Shaun, and I think Baby Driver even more so is that there are like longer developing masters. So it is that thing where I like that sort of style of like quick, slow. It's like you sort of
contrast.
You're always like sort of keeping people on their toes, So it was always important to me in Baby Driver that there were like, as well as like some sequences that was sort of very intense in terms of the amount of imagery, there are also some action parts or some romantic parts, like the restaurant scene is a good example, like where it's playing out essentially in one setup.
Yeah,
I think to your question as well, because each movie that Edgar does is so different, either genre-wise or stylistic-wise. Obviously, they all stand on their own as separate things, and sonically they sound totally different,
and appropriate to the story.
And
we haven't even really talked about Scott Pilgrim.
Well,
another good example, is in The World's End. A good example of that. Another one that I think is the sound of like cell phone interference, which is always a sound that creeps me out.
Yeah.
Because when people sort of say, "Oh, like cell phones give you cancer," I always think that is the sound of it, because it sounds like terrifying. It's a terrifying sound.
And when you hear it, you think, "I'm getting cancer."
Yeah, no, totally. It does actually freak me out, and I don't take as many calls, and I do more texting, partly because of that sound. So in The World's End, that sound is happening all the way through, and it is incorporated into Steve Price's score. So if you start to notice, once the kind of the robot invasion starts to happen, you'll start to hear that sound more, because it's a sound that makes me uneasy, and it's a sound that we then like built into the sound design and then the score.
That must have been a very difficult mix for you.
I mean, they all like sort of they're like
they all have their challenges.
I mean, Scott Pilgrim is another hugely ambitious mix in terms of the amount of stuff that's going on in that movie.
Well, yeah, and just appropriate to the subject matter, because I mean, I'm guessing I'm not a big gaming person, but I'm presuming that there's a huge amount of gaming stuff that you pulled into, and Easter eggs in that track. And
it's mostly all original sounds designed from the ground up to assimilate.
Evocative of
8-bit, absolutely.
Very rough
and
game sound.
And like in Scott Pilgrim, each fight sequence
is distinctive.
Is distinctive sonically. The punches in the Roxy fight are different to the punches in another fight. You know, each separate fight in that movie sonically has a different signature, and that all obviously weave together.
Yeah,
but they're all separate with regards to how they sound.
Well, Julian, I have to ask you. You know, obviously you don't work exclusively with Edgar. You do
What?
other you do other films. This is coming as
Well,
news
he
to
only
Edgar,
makes films
obviously.
once every 3 years, so.
But you just to call out a few, you did some work on Mad Max Fury Road. You supervised Attack the Block, which is I think just a wonderful sounding film. In Bruges, which I think most people don't necessarily think of as like a sound design extravaganza, but was a really kind of just a very lovely track. So, I mean, not naming names or getting yourself into trouble, but like, how is working with Edgar different than working with other directors?
First and foremost, because we've been working together so long, and because Edgar has allowed me to become part of his creative team, the involvement is, for me, I come on board much earlier, and I'm much more part of that process, and I feel I can help or guide or advise Edgar even before the shoot. So there's that aspect. And there's also, obviously just the fact that Edgar is a director who, for me, cares about the sound process to the maximum degree, and will never let go of something until we just keep polishing it and polishing it and polishing it and polishing it. There are many more directors that I work with who are passionate about sound and do care about sound. Like selfishly, with something like Baby Driver, where the soundscape it's in the DNA of the script. It's what Edgar, from when Edgar first started writing it, he's thinking about it. So for someone like me, someone texted me the other day and said, in fact yesterday, who saw Baby Driver and said, I wish I could work on movies like Baby Driver. And my reply was, I don't know if I'll ever get to do it again, because it is a
it's a very special
I
thing.
know that if Edgar so chooses to work with me again, I know that it will be a sonic, a rewarding thing for me sonically, because of the way Edgar works. I know whatever Edgar does, Edgar could do two people talking in one location, and it'll be a rich and rewarding thing for me, because Edgar will look at it and figure out things to do with the sound, and not just have it as, this is the picture, this is the sound just follows the picture, and the two things are kind of, So, yeah, I just feel lucky. I genuinely just feel lucky.
So, Edgar, one last question for you. If you were mentoring a young filmmaker who is just starting out, what would you tell him or her about why sound design and sound effects are important?
I think, like I said before, I think it's something that I remember hearing early on about, like, the way to make, if you're doing a low budget film, the way to make it seem more professional is to make sure the sound is as good as it can be. And you can notice that, like, as soon as you watch something that's like sort of like, a zero budget movie, like I was watching some like independent movie from like the 60s, there was like a cult movie, and the sound was so bad, it was like, I had to turn it off at some point, because I couldn't kind of like sort of like
It's painful,
it was
right?
painful to listen to. So I think that's the thing, is I think sort of it's something that like I don't think that when people are like aspiring film directors, I think they're sometimes just thinking about the coolest shots, and maybe they think about editing, but they don't really think about that aspect as well. And obviously they go hand in hand. And like the great thing about doing Baby Driver is it was really, I think it was in my initial pitch, it was like a sort of, like said like this is like designed to be seen large and loud, I was thinking, actually, it just reminded me, somebody said on the internet, and I can't remember who this person is, but it was almost the best review of the movie. Somebody said, just after it came out, said, Baby Driver is the best movie I ever heard. And I thought, that's a great review.
That'll do.
I can't think of a better way to wrap it up than with that.
Thank you, anonymous Twitter person.
There you go.
Thank you.
Well, thank you again to Edgar Wright and Julian Slater for coming in and spending some time with us today and talking about their remarkable collaboration across these films. This is Glenn Kaiser wrapping things up for the Dolby Institute and the Soundworks Collection. Thanks a lot, guys.
Thank you.